Hi, I'm Patrick Joseph Healy. I am the writer of Please Let Me Save You. You can find me at Patrick Joseph Healy on TikTok and Instagram or at patrickjosephhealy.com and check out my Kickstarter by searching Please Let Me Save You or going to pleaseletmesaveYou.com. And you're watching and listening to Two Geeks Talking.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industries. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We are joined today by a multi-talented individual, from psychology to marketing to now an author of an amazing new prose novel called Please Let Me Save You. We're joined by the ever-talented Patrick Joseph Healy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for asking. How are you, Kurt?
I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. I found it interesting because I always love brand new guests to the show because I don't know what's going to happen other than the base research I do. But I love new authors. I love the fact that you've been in multiple industries. I love the fact that you're putting together a pretty unique book when it comes to this series. I'm getting ahead of myself as I usually do because I'm so excited to talk to you about this here. For those that don't know anything about yourself as a creative person, tell us who you are and what you're bringing to Two Geeks Talking today.
I am an author. I have my education in psychology, but my first job out of college was with IDW Publishing, marketing and editorial intern working on titles like Transformers and G.I. Joe and Lock and Key. And then from there, I tried to set out and find my place in the world in a way where I could take my fascination with how the world works, how people work, how they think, how they feel, integrate that into my art and storytelling. Since I've been just completely captivated by the idea of storytelling and emotional expression since I was a child, from theater to I began writing in the 7th grade. So I then spent, 15 years going from one spot to another. I was writing interviews for the comic book industry, focusing on things like Comic-Con and the culture reviews, things like that. I went into video marketing and I was doing like late night direct response commercials for brands like Lipozene and Fire and Ice Therapy. I was an associate creative director for a presentation design agency. I got to work with Fortune 500 clients and help them work on their messaging and their presentation. And I've just kind of been all over the map. And the thing is, at 42, I've really come to accept that my harmony, where I really land in the middle is just storytelling, not trying to sell something, which is the dark side of being an indie author, because you still have to end up selling something, but really committing myself to the art of trying to put someplace in another world, specifically one that is the manifestation of my own hopes and fears.
That's not too deep whatsoever.
Oh, good.
Because you've been in so many industries, especially with comics and how hard it is to market yourself, whether it's comics or prose or whatever the case may be, what's the most misunderstood aspect about being a marketer for yourself in the comic and prose industry?
That's a really good question. I think that the most misunderstood part is that, speaking of a broad group of people, that most of them are probably withdrawn, sensitive, introspective, and probably not someone who exudes a ton of confidence. Otherwise, instead of honing their craft for years and years and years, they probably would have been out having a social life. Maybe. Not everybody, but a good majority. But to be the sort of person from that demographic who is a name, a known comic book artist, a known street artist, a known whatever, you also have to be someone who braves that discomfort of putting yourself out there and saying, hey, I am worth something. I'm worth 2 hours of your time. I'm worth $10. I'm worth 350 pages. I am worth it, and you'll be happy. And it's not doing that once, which you could do very forgettably. It's doing it always and forever as a brand. In doing so, putting yourself across as someone that you're not, for many people, for some people, it's absolutely who they are. But for many people, it's putting yourself out there as something you're not, and then dealing with the imposter syndrome of feeling like there's this divorce between the way in which you're embraced and who you think you really are and how you feel received. I think that it's impossible to ever really know when you're being exposed to this cultivated depiction of a person, of a talent, between that and who they really are and how they really feel about themselves.
especially when I started this show specific, I always called myself an introverted extrovert. I was forced
Oh
to
yeah.
become an extrovert because I have to interview people. So I think it's interesting the fact that we show our brands, we show ourselves to the masses, especially with the way social media is specifically. And it's either a cultivated view on our own perspective of what we're trying to present ourselves or our brands or whatever we're trying to produce. But I also find it's interesting the fact that we can't always get that message across. And I think that's the most difficult aspect, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to being people.
Yeah. That's the art of communication. And that's the art that ties human civilization together.
So how does that tie into, of course, Please Let Me Save You? Because that's what we're here to talk about today.
You know what? It's really funny that you should ask that, because Please Let Me Save You and the Agony series speak to how our communication informs reality. In Please Let Me Save You, the first character we meet, Brandon, discovers that every time he dies, he finds himself exactly where he was 30 minutes earlier. He has a total knowledge of everything that has just happened, but he's right where he was. And unfortunately, this is the day the atomic bombs fall and land not too far from where he is. He dies and dies and dies again and grows only 30 minutes at a time with these small amounts of knowledge. Makes this glacial progress through this attempt to escape this time loop that he's in. But in it, he meets these people, and glacially, he understands that the small nuances of how he presents himself, how he speaks to someone, can really change how they perceive the world, can hypnotize them. If you do it just right, in just the right way, if you find the person who's receptive enough, because that is the nature of communication. You know, reality is subjective, and it's different things to different people. And it's communication that adheres our realities into one. And the Agony series explores that. The third book, this is going to sound crazy, but begins with a Homo Neanderthal tribe. And the main character has Brandon's resetting ability, but instead of resetting 30 minutes after her death, she resets in the womb with total knowledge.
Wow.
And given this cycle that she's going through, she sews language together because she slowly learns what the sounds that everyone else is making mean, and develops through her different lives a very rapidly advanced Homo Neanderthal culture. The idea is it's that communication which accelerates us. We talk about how far we've come since social media has shown up, how far we've come, you know, a subjective term, but it's through the expansion of discourse, the breakdown of barriers like distance or language. It's communication that really advances us. And so how does that relate to that? Agony as a series is very much about reality and whether or not we share it, and how communication informs that.
Because you've created such a complex narrative with this time loop, especially with these three interconnected stories, you know, what was your eureka moment for this particular structure? And do you have a step-by-step process for just mapping out these storylines?
Yes, thank you very much for asking me this question. I began outlining the Agony series in 2019, late 2019. And a lot of things went into informing what the story became. But at the time, I was playing Fallout 4 a lot. Yeah, thank you. You're nodding. Thank you. Hello. Yes. So in 2019, I'm thinking, you know, will this ever be a television series? And if so, how can you do Fallout righteously? And as I'm doing that, I'm in this subway tunnel and I'm fighting these raiders, and I have just quick saved at the wrong time. And I'm dying over and over and over again. And I do not want to go back as far as I would have to go to my next save. No, I'm not doing it. In the darkness of this subway, I'm thinking, boy, this is, if you took this really literally, if this wasn't an escapist video game and this was your life, this is darkness. And I thought about the next time, you know, you show up at Sanctuary and you find Percy or whatever, and he talks to you like he saw you that morning. For your character, for you as a player, so much more time has passed. Your skill level has increased. You're a different person. And video games aren't set up to reflect that, just because of the nature of what video games are. But for me, that was part of the Fallout experience, is that there was one person who was going through this and having a completely different experience of time that no one else could appreciate. And I thought, well, if you put that in a show where one character, he just goes back in time, well, what are the stakes? Yeah. I mean, who the hell cares about that? To balance that, I had to create a rich cast of characters with their own stories and narratives that you gave a damn about. that you're like, I don't care. I don't care what happens with that character. I have to know what happens over here. Not that you don't care, but that you also need this as much as you need the other. So I spent a lot of time ideating on just scenes that I wanted to see. I was listening to a playlist of mood music that I created and just creating the different scenes that I wanted to happen and finding where the commonalities in the characters were and then plucking out the one that would be the time looping character, introducing him early in the story so that there could be space between his events and everybody else's, so that it wasn't just time looping over and over again like you would see in something like The Edge of Tomorrow, where it's just, and I haven't seen that movie, but I assume it's just the same thing. You then move on to someone else's story, and when you come back to it at some point in time, you get a sense of eternity. You get a sense of forever because that second has been stretched across many experiences. And now you really know what that time looping character feels like. And you know that hell just as much as you appreciate everything else that's going on. And that's how I got there. That is my very concise and direct answer.
That movie you talked about with Tom Cruise and Emily Hunt. Great film. Actually, really well done, surprisingly, for a Tom Cruise film that usually you can figure out in 7 seconds. I think it's interesting because you see time traveling series like Quantum Leap, the classics, Quantum Leap, you see Back to the Future, but then you go into manga and anime and things like that actually take it to a whole nother level where, oh no, you're being completely reborn and regenerated. There's so many different avenues you go. I love the fact that you took like a video game series as a basis of inspiration and just put it into this prose novel. I think that's just really incredible.
Yeah.
So at least you're being unique in that case.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my hope that this experience would celebrate that for someone who plays video games and be like, oh, I know that frustration. I've been there too. That's where it's accessible to me. You know what I mean? You
went to school for psychology. You went into marketing, which is a heck of a shift, by the way. You're now turned an author. How has your various professional background shaped your character development and research?
It's a really good question. I would say psychology and marketing differently, though they're both about sort of understanding an audience. It's just your audience is either an individual or thousands or millions. And it begins with sort of understanding the base characteristics of who you're talking to and creating a really clear depiction of that. Making sure that not only do you feel inspired by your content, but that you can envision really specifically another person who will be. And for me, it was my childhood friend, Gabe Gutierrez. In a lot of ways, like I wrote this first book for him because he and I are both huge horror fans. And we've seen them all, but if you mentioned one we hadn't seen, we'd watch it together. And I wanted to make something for him that like celebrated the tonality of some of those films, books like The Stand or whatever, and made it fresh, but still adhered to the awe and spectacle that you feel watching horror movies in the 80s and 90s when things aren't CGI and they're not digital and you're too young to know that can't be real. And just it's like, I don't know how they could have filmed it if it didn't really happen. That's too real. I wanted to inspire that. And so I think that was how marketing informed that. Psychology is actually a little different because I think it's the opposite of fiction. Psychology is the study of what you would expect, what you would predict from a person based on what you know, based on what you've read in studies, based on what's been observed and accepted by the scientific community. Fiction is about embracing the truth of humanity. And the truth of humanity is contradictory to what is logical. It's often contradictory to what is beneficial to the individual or to the group. If psychology was effective at predicting human behavior and explaining it, we wouldn't need psychologists. We could just write a manual that would say, if you feel this, go to this page, this is the explanation, you're fine. Fiction is I don't want to say better explanation of humanity. It's an expression of humanity, whereas one's the study of humanity. It's an expression of humanity because it looks at all the ways in which psychology says, boy, that behavior is interesting, and I wish I could figure that out. It is a balance to fiction writing, I would say, because oftentimes I have to say, yeah, it wouldn't make sense to do this, but this person is scared.
Being in IT, the fact that everything was very logical and very straightforward, if this, then this, if psychology could get to that level, it would be so much easier, and then you wouldn't have to worry about, ids and egos and all that other fun stuff.
We would have them on staff at major corporations. Someone would be like, I'm upset about what I get paid. And they'd be like, go talk to Phil. And Phil would be like, this is how you make someone not care about what they're paid. Say this. It just doesn't work that way, though. I'll tell you something else. I have In this story, Brandon's girlfriend is an actress and she's just about to like break into the A-list. She is considering breaking up with him to focus on her career. Before he really tries to escape the bomb, which is completely impossible, he wants to convince her that the bomb is going to fall, which can't be done because that's ridiculous. How could you know a bomb is going to fall? And of course, you're not being resurrected or looped or whatever. That's insane. And he's trying over and over again to convince her of what's going to happen so he can at least try to escape with her and learn how to convince her as quickly as possible to trust him and do it. And I had readers say, I don't understand why this person would suffer this way for someone who could just leave them. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't seem logical. And then, yeah, you're right. If you're thinking about what you would expect a person to do, it's not logical. But there are people who will suffer endlessly for the person they love and just be unable to move on because that's their plight in life. They have a hook in their heart, and if logic dictated human behavior, they would move on. But that's not how humanity works.
Yeah, love is blind.
Love is blind and relentless, which is a dangerous combination.
Well, so is a nuclear bomb, but I mean...
Yes, well, there you go.
I'm interested about the skill aspect, about the glacier pace that you were going for, especially with the ever-evolving skills that your main character possesses. Does every character possess it in terms of the time loop aspect of it with your 3 interconnected stories, or is it just Brandon?
It's just Brandon. It's the one benefit to this curse of knowing all these things that he can't convince anyone else of, is he can focus on himself and try to learn every way he can to improve himself to be equal to the situation he's given. There was a lot of moments in 2020. I wanted to make the world a better place, either in a broad way or for people, for a person specifically. And there was so many moments where I realized the circumstance is greater than my capacity. And I can express, well wishes, I can express good intent, but I can't change this. And that manifests in Brandon's helplessness as he's trying to save the person he loves from destruction. Whether or not she chooses to be with him, he wants to save her. There's no escape from that. Once you get to that point where you want to make the world a better place and you don't know how, but you can't escape the situation that makes you want to escape. You can't give up. You have to just keep desperately trying. And that kind of all goes back to that moment.
Are you holding out for hope in this series? Are you holding out for the fact that you're trying to survive something that have you gotten past your walls that you've put up for yourself for this?
That's a wonderful question. And I really appreciate that. The truth is, like I said, I've been working on this for 5 years. And I finished the book a couple of years ago, and I was giving it to people, and the feedback was, hey, it's kind of bleak. And one of the things I realized was it was a manifestation of my despair that for a very long time I had been so surrounded by, I couldn't really see. Not being able to see the forest for the trees sort of situation. And what I had to do in the next year was look at ways to inspire my brain to feel hope, to create moments where people were not just terrified and cowering, oh my God, I'm scary, but on the edge of their seat because they're riding the momentum and they believe that there is a positive outcome. I had to do a lot of work on how my brain processes emotion and a lot of visualization. You know what I did? So I created these mood playlists, and they're awesome, right? And if you want to feel a foreboding sense of impending doom, let me know. But I was thinking about in the 90s when you'd watch a movie and then the credits would roll and the song they'd play would be like completely unrelated to what you'd just seen. And maybe it rubs you the wrong way the first few times, but after a few watch throughs, like I want to hear Annie Lennox sing Song for a Vampire at the end of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Does it make sense? No. Why is Prince singing Arms of Orion at the end of Batman? What does Kiss from a Rose have to do with Batman Forever? But things are so tied to the films that they balance out your emotional recollection of it. Whether or not that's the intent, it's what it does. And so I started listening to songs that had nothing to do at all with what I had written, things that I could imagine playing during the end credits. If what I just written was a film, what song would I want to hear that would be the opposite? Visualize a music video for that song. I think I chose Love Like Mine by Prof. And then put those scenes in that book, those scenes that didn't happen because you just weren't there. Put those in there on top of everything else and balance out that emotional experience. People just started eating up the book after that. And I had to move my outline around, like my 3-book outline, these series of events and revelations, because I'm like, people are hungry for this experience. I can't be stubborn about this. This is obviously what works. So I had to open myself up to not only being rigid about what I had done, but not being rigid about cataclysmic doom. And actually, that's something I'm still working with and will continue to have to develop, because now that I've done it with this first book, I have to do it for the next 2 books in the outline, where I bring up those strings and make it more hopeful. I compare this series to Wizard of Oz meets Hellraiser. The first book is the tornado taking Dorothy and Toto to Oz. Second 2 books, they don't meet the Lollipop Guild, but it's much darker. And that I do really well. Those scenes I'm going to do really well. Now I have to put other things in there so that people don't just say, I can't go back for more, man. This is too much.
You could pull the whole Star Wars episode 4, 5, and 6, where it's like, there's hope, there's, the despair in the Empire, and then it's like, okay, now everything's maybe okay. We don't really know. And then just completely do a reboot and go 1, 2, 3.
At a certain point in time, I have to stop saying what happens. And I think at the very end is when I have to be like, Patrick, stop. You're talking too much.
The fact that you've given this to other people to read, what has been their reactions specifically to the series? And why did you feel it necessary to make slight adjustments as you were writing the series?
I think most writers probably share their work with people who are closest to them first. And this might sound silly, but my mother is one of those people. And I could not get her to read this. And she was just saying, it was too anxiety provoking. And I was like, this is ridiculous. It can't possibly be that intense. I shared it with other people and I thought about it. And the original ending for Please Let Me Save You was kind of similar to the ending for The Grapes of Wrath. I knew it wasn't going to be something where everybody's like, yeah, like the end of Rocky. Yeah, they did it. But it was going to be like, well, let's talk about how that makes us feel. It was going to be a small moment of hope crushed by a sea of despair that would connect to the idea that things were moving forward in a new direction. Yeah, sure, that's an ending. And I'm thinking, well, Grapes of Wrath can do it, so can I. Which is not how reality works, obviously. I just had to sit with that, because I gave it to a few people, and yeah, they're like, I enjoy your writing, you do these certain things well, but I could tell they're not in love with it. And I had to sit with that until I could accept why it was. I knew why it was. It was because I set out to create the scariest thing I could imagine. And I did that. But I didn't know how to really inspire people, because I didn't want people to be sad or feeling despair, but captivated, because in my mind, when I came up with it, that's what I envisioned, and that's what I knew I could do. I could capture that somehow where I could make it more like a ride than a horror show. But I had to allow myself that time, because I just could accept that I wasn't there yet.
Because you're writing this series, making this a 3-book deal, how do you view your relationship with fiction and mental health?
Kind of like the relationship between what we eat and how we feel. It's just, instead of what we take in, it's what we put out. But still, it's what we choose, how that nourishes our minds and our souls. Working on this in the darker phases was very nourishing for my creativity. I guess I wanted to convince myself that I really could come up with something that was different. I've been writing all my life. I love coming up with a new story. I hate doing anything that is an iteration of something else. I hate the idea. I was asked to write a book for Galatine Publishing about vampires and fairies, and it's like, no, don't put me in one of your tropish, cliche, trendy kind of, don't let me, I can't do that. I wanted to convince myself that I could exist in a meaningful way within horror without refashioning something that already existed. Which isn't to say that post-apocalyptic horror isn't already a thing. Clearly, that's done to death. But it is my hope that at the end of these books, you say, I've never experienced anything like that.
Speaking of horror, then, I'm curious, if you want to get someone into horror, give me an author someone should read, a director someone should look at, his or her bodies of work, whatever other mediums that I'm missing here.
That's a really good question, particularly since I know that horror has really descended into this masochistic exploration of how we can somehow vilify sexuality but glorify violence. And that is not what I mean by horror. And that is something that I want to avoid where possible. You know, the world is a cruel place and there is cruelty in horror, but I want to avoid gorish, overly indulgent graphic violence. And I want to deviate from the things that are so common. You know, that would be kind of cliche to go that way. But I think that Clive Barker is a good place to look for what I'm referring to in terms of horror. I think that if you look at a story like Hellraiser, see the ways in which your joys can be pursued to the point of suffering, and you tie that into analogies like addiction or love obsession, the story presents something that is very human in such a terrifying way that it keeps you up at night. There is gore involved in that, but I don't think that it is necessarily the gore that shocks you, though it does dehumanize the characters, which is part of the story. This idea that the story of our life is that we're special. Mommy and daddy, they were special too, and I'm special, and God loves me, and I'm wonderful. And that's our security. And the things that threaten that are scary. And so, you know, in something like Hellraiser, when you see body parts, it's not like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it is indulgent for the sake of shock value. It is to illustrate that you are not permanent, you are temporary, and this security that you have is a fantasy. The books that follow, I talked to you about how communication brings society together. One of the things that happens early in the second book is this exploration that as we cease to agree on what reality is, reality ceases to exist. In the world that we live in, where there's a mass media function, where everybody sees sort of the same thing, the same movies, there's limited discourse, you get large groups of people who believe relatively same things with some maybe big difference. But in this story, the population of the United States has drastically dropped. There's more segregation because groups are smaller, there's more fear, and they believe different things, and reality literally cracks. And through that crack comes this darkness that in the mythology of the story, if the second book was coming out in a week, or if the third book was coming out in a week, maybe I'd say, just read it and see. Right now, I'll say, if you remember this when you get there, good on you. But in the mythology of the books, there is this ancient space god called possibility. He is the god of all things that aren't, all things that isn't, all things that never were. In this moment, that darkness that erodes certainty, pours into the world, exacerbates our unraveling. I started writing this in 2020 because I believed in March of 2020 that we had seen the end of the world. The end of the world was the US's inability to contain COVID-19. And what we saw at that moment was the beginning destabilization from which our global society would never recover. The United States was a stabilizing global force, and its own instability was doomed to have a ripple effect. And it was not something that I realistically believed we could turn around. 2020 is the bomb because I wanted to show that destabilization in a way that wasn't political, where someone would be like, no, tariffs are good. No, this is bad because this person said that, but like, it's a nuclear bomb. Okay. Can we all agree that's bad? That's bad, right? Now things are destabilized. Can we agree on this? Let's move forward. But it explores the way in which we as a society increasingly lived in different worlds and about how that is eventually going to be our erosion if we can't agree meaningfully on what is real.
Lots to unpack there.
5 years.
Are you okay? I guess is the other question.
I'm doing my best every day. Okay. I appreciate it.
That's good. That's good to know. Being a Canadian and up north, you know, we're not really looking down on you. Geographically we are. But in terms of, you know, being in the same hemisphere, we can only do so much as it stands. But that's why we have escapism. That's why we have books like yours and the mediums that we consume, whether it's real or not, or whatever possibilities, because we always have a choice to decide how we want to live our lives, as limited as that lifespan is. So when it comes then to the lessons you want to actually convey, what can someone reading this take away from this book?
This book was designed to shatter the sense of invulnerability that people had. This concept that because we have yet to suffer severe consequences for our compounding crises, we never will, that there will be some magical fix. And I wanted to do that by showing people that the cracks in society are already there. This book was intended, when I started writing it in 2020, maybe to come out in 2022.
when, someone might have been like, wow, you're a prophet. And now they're like, Jesus Christ, you were taking this from the headlines, which obviously there isn't a nuclear bomb. But I did have this fear for a few years, that this concern that people would not be able to ever appreciate the anxiety of the book because 2020 was so far behind them, it had become a dream. And now I see it as something that people will really connect to. I don't want to compare it to The Handmaid's Tale because how arrogant. But at the same time, when we talk about fiction as escapism, why would you want to escape into this? First of all, we know that people do. They do escape into these dark parallels to our own reality. And that's because one of the things that we're looking to escape is how we view the world, not just how we feel, but something that allows us to see things in a clearer fashion, manifest our feelings in a way that's different than how we're already dealing with them, so that we can see them in a different context and maybe move them just a little further from ourselves. I think it is hard to placate an entire society of people who are dealing with different anxieties with one piece of pure innocent escapism. If I ever get the idea, I'd love to do it, but it's a really rare thing. I think it's a little unfair to try to create something that asks someone to completely live in a different world. Yeah, this is fun, right? Your world sucks. You have to live in this gumball world because otherwise you're depressed. And I think you look at something like The Handmaid's Tale and you're just like, boy, I'm upset, but I'm rooting for that person and I want to see them come out because I want to see myself come out. That's the kind of escapism we're looking for, where we see somebody with a path to heroism or overcome or simply escape.
In a world where Amazon is print on demand, where you have publishing, where you can go to any publisher literally online, here's my book, print it. What unique advantages do you see in maintaining a printed inventory of your books? Because everyone is so used to digital these days.
No, I appreciate that question. I'm running this Kickstarter right now because I'm trying to get my book printed in paperback and hardcover, because Amazon, with one hand, removed some of the gatekeepers to publishing and to being an author by providing things, Kindle Unlimited or, print on demand and all these things. But at the same time, they stepped in as their own gatekeeper in a sense, in that the person who creates it never has their own physical product. They don't have a connection to the reader if they were able to send the book out to, a reviewer. Part of the marketing aspect is physically showing something to people, because that's how people think of things, as physical, real things. Part of the success of marketing is that it is actually real, not something that exists only when you decide to purchase it, but that it's real now, it's yours, and you should go out and get it. Makes it more likely to find its way into readers that aren't just, I don't want to say sucking from the teat of Amazon, but receiving only literature through Amazon. I don't know. They went out of their way to kill small bookstores. They went out of their way to kill big bookstores. And now we're in this conversation where it's, how do I escape this mass murder in the literary culture? And that's through having your own inventory. And that's why it's so important that I find people who are willing to support this Kickstarter, because I know in the long run, it's not just good for me, it's good for readers, and it's good for a culture that learns to not rely entirely on this exploitative corporate entity.
Let's talk about the actual campaign itself here.
So, I am not a stranger to Kickstarters. I used to do Kickstarters all the time when I was running my pin business. But this is the first Kickstarter I've done for a book. And so I had to completely think about or rethink how I was going to do rewards. And I was able to come up with some fun things. I figured I would distribute digital ARCs, digital advanced reader copies, to people who supported the Kickstarter, so that people could read it early if they were interested. Digitally signed marketing material, kind of fun things like that. And then I came up with other options like at one of them is I'll beta read your book. If you have a book that you're looking and you want me to beta read your book, I will beta read your book, which is a big gift for me, because the truth is I am a huge writer and a slow reader. But I wanted to come up with different ways that I could interact with people. I share a ton of the character trailers on the page so that people can get to know each one of the characters separately. One of the things I really wanted to portray was this world of diverse characters, because that's the world we live in. And it's hard when you are trying to pitch a book and you're giving an elevator pitch in which you can't name 6 different people. You have to name one person, maybe two. And so the Kickstarter is a really great place for people who want to see the diversity of the cast of characters and find out how they integrate into the story overall and how the different stories connect. So we've got at one of the lowest levels, we've got the digitally signed copies of the marketing material, which has the book cover and then some of the other images that I made that depict some of the more exciting moments from the story. We have the digital book if you pledge at the next level, and that is something that I can share with people very shortly after they pledge, so that they can read an advanced copy of Please Let Me Save You before it even comes out. At the next level, you can pledge to get the audio recording, which I plan to record myself next month. The sooner the better. But then after that, there's the paperback, and at this level, you have the ability to get all these things together. So you're getting the digital stuff, you're getting the e-reader version now before the book ever comes out. You've got the audio when it becomes available, and I send you the printed paperback when it arrives. And from there, we go to the hardcover, and then another iteration where you get everything up until that point. We have thank you pages if someone just wants to pledge at a certain level and be noted on my author website on the thank you page. There's different levels for people who want to be in the actual printed copies and the paperback and the hardcover. There's opportunities for digital meet and greets. And then, of course, the beta reading, which is something that I truly consider a big thing because I'm very passionate about not just beta reading, but like giving people my thoughts and the art of storytelling. So if anybody really wants someone who is passionate about communication to give them honest feedback, I think that's a good way to go. And it's at $1,000, probably one of the best ways to make sure that these books get out there into the world.
What, honesty and reviews? What? I didn't think that was possible in this day and age.
Yeah, when I don't commonly beta read for people, but when I do, like I have to be really upfront. It's like, look, you don't have to do anything I say, but I am going to tell you everything I think you should do. Because otherwise I can't be interested enough to actually read it. Like, if you don't care what I think, what am I reading that for?
Because you're really passionate, and that's why I love interviews like this. You're so passionate about what you're doing because you're invested in what you're doing and you're excited about what you're doing. I think that really shows in our conversation here today. Everyone usually asks, what's the wisest piece of advice or what's the most BS piece of advice you've ever received? But what is the second wisest piece of advice you've received that has stuck with you in your various careers?
The one thing I remember is my dad telling me the importance of knowing a person's name. That is always true in any career and in any industry, in every interaction. It's one of the most powerful things that you can know. It is one of the most powerful things that you can incorporate into a conversation. When I was selling pins, I would always record a video and send it to the person who'd made the purchase, regardless of the amount, so that I could use their name and they could hear their name, because that is such a reinforcing thing. And so I would say, though it was not specific to any piece of advice, and in retrospect, I don't know why he kept saying it to me, but he did. And I always found it to be true. There was so many things my dad said to me where I'm like, you can go to hell and die. But there was a handful of things where I'm like, yeah, I'll give you that one.
Everyone usually has one person that inspired them on their path to where they are today. Who was that for you?
Nobody. I wish that wasn't the answer. If I had someone who inspired me to go down this path, I don't think I would be doing it 42. I would have done it earlier. My mother was an anchor woman, and my mother had a really stellar career, something I thought was really cool, and just no one else did. And I was like, wow, she really went out and pursued her dreams. But she was always encouraging me to be practical first. And when I wanted to pursue acting, it was like, yeah, but get a 9 to 5 first. And, when I wanted to be a writer, it's like, get a stable job first. And I spent a lot of my life trying to fit myself into a mold that I was never going to fit into. And that's not just an attitudinal thing. Like when I was diagnosed as having learning disabilities and ADHD in the third grade, it was literally something that my mother was told directly, he's just never going to thrive. He's going to struggle his whole life. And I did. I struggled my whole life. I waited tables forever because I didn't believe in myself enough to pursue what I wanted to do. When I got that job at IDW Publishing, it was a year after I considered applying there. And I've often thought, boy, if I had done it a year sooner, maybe they would have had room on their staff to take me on full time after. And there were all these moments. I got my education in psychology, and then I was afraid to become a psychologist because I didn't want to abandon my daughter. I had all these moments where I just really didn't know how to be who I was, and there was not a person there telling me how to do it. And it's only because at 42, with probably half my life behind me, I know where that course of action takes me. I know the satisfaction it gives me. And what propels me forward is not the beckoning call of a mentor, though I wish it were. It's sort of like I admit that my life until this point has been madness. And I have to just close my eyes and run in the opposite direction of that madness. And what that looks like is putting myself out there. Being neurodivergent, I have a lot of rejection sensitive dysphoria and really negative narratives, and it's hard for me to put myself out there. I have decided that I have to force myself to do this because I know this is my authentic self, and I wasn't taught to embrace that authentic self or pursue that authentic self. I was taught to mask who I was and integrate into what the world needed me to be. Yeah, I'm just kind of running blindly into the future.
Aren't we all, though?
Very true. Very true.
From a professional standpoint, you are successful. Do you consider yourself personally successful?
That's a great question. In many ways, I do. And I try to orient myself to those ways. As I said, I have ADHD, and I spent a lot of my life struggling with emotional dysregulation, not understanding why I didn't operate the way other people did. And I have spent the last maybe 3 years, 2 or 3 years, learning about how my neurodiversity influences who I am. Because I've spent 40 years thinking about how nurture had influenced who I was, how my trauma had influenced who I was, how my childhood had influenced who I was, and trying to rectify those things. And for the first time, I started thinking, well, why don't you think about yourself from a neurological point of view and not just, psychological, but maybe more psychiatric. So I started thinking about myself from that point of view, and I learned to control things like my temper, which I had never had any control over my whole life. It was this destructive presence drove people away and reminded me of my own trauma. It was this way in which I had been victimized, and now I was being this, I don't want to say victimizer, but when you're out there and you're just showing your anger to the world, you don't have to hurt someone or injure them to be victimizing them in a way, because you're needlessly exposing them to negativity. I had felt helplessly exposed to that as a child, and then I felt as a helpless perpetrator of that as an adult. And in the last 4 years, I found ways to manage and understand why I experienced anger that way, to be able to experience that overstimulation and say, this is the moment where I become that person, and this is how I can change that. This is the moment where I feel cataclysmic fear or paranoia, and this is how I can look away. This is how I feel fear, and how I can try to be more inspired. But on top of all those things, on top of the emotional dysregulation, there is the discordant thoughts. I tend to have several trains of thoughts happening at one time. When I'm writing and in a state of hyperfocus, all those thought lines mesh, and I exist in this wonderful cohesion. But outside that, I can be disjointed, and it can be hard for me to understand why people are telling me certain things. I've begun to appreciate how some of the ways in which I struggle with literal communication has affected me in terms of just my interaction with other people. And the very fact that I can look at those things now and be patient with myself when I see those struggles and say, I regret the things that I've done, not just all anger things, but times in which I was so emotionally guarded because I didn't know how to experience my emotions without them getting the better of me, that I made choices I regretted. I look at those things and say, that's the origin story, and that's the past. It's like Bruce Wayne obsessing over his parents in Crime Alley. They're dead, Bruce. Stop kneeling, get up and walk away. And don't go out there and be a crazy person who beats people up and puts on a mask and manifests your anger. Accept what's happened and move forward and be your best self. And so, would I say I'm successful? I think that's probably the most important thing I could be in life. I've heard Rainn Wilson talk about how unhappy he was during The Office because his movies weren't blowing up. But he's friggin' Rainn Wilson playing Dwight K. Schrute, one of the most perfect performances ever, and he couldn't appreciate that. So I think that to be able to appreciate yourself, to be able to work on yourself, I think that is probably what success is, even more than the monetary remuneration of my labor.
The reverse of success is failure. How do you deal with your failures?
That's a good question. I think that's a false dichotomy. I don't think the opposite of success is failure. I think that what we term as failure is maybe just our flow, our path, our journey. I would think of it, instead of being a moment where we stand and we're judged as successful or failing. We think of our work, of our time professionally, personally on this earth, as just part of a journey. And maybe you haven't reached where you're going yet, but that doesn't mean that you're not still going there. If you're to say, I have failed because I'm not yet at the top of the mountain, well, then maybe you're going to stop walking because you're a freaking failure, man. You've already failed. But if you realize, hey, man, I'm just not at the top of the mountain yet, and I'm just going to do my best to keep going there. I can't make any guarantees about when I'll be there. I think that if and when we can do that as individuals, we can get away from some of the stigma of the concept of failing that prevents people from moving forward. And I know that fear of failure, when I talk about things like rejection sensitive dysphoria, that fear of failure killed a lot of my dreams in life. Times when I just didn't put myself out there because I felt like I would be overcome by what I would feel when it didn't work. And so I didn't try because I didn't want to be defeated. I'd rather defeat myself. And it's because I think culturally we embrace that sort of false dichotomy of failure versus success.
The younger generation is looking at your work and they're becoming inspired to be creative in their own way, whether it's as a marketer or as a writer. Maybe you've inspired them down that path. And the fact that you have the younger generation with you, maybe you're inspiring them down their path as well. How can they inspire the generation that follows them?
That's a really good question. How can they inspire the generation that follows them? I don't want to talk about Fight Club like it is the Bible or like it's a real thermometer temperature read on what society was. But I think that if you've ever read Fight Club or seen the movie and you were from the 90s, you connected to how meaningless we felt as individuals and culture and how disconnected we felt from what was going on, as opposed to, say, the 40s, where there's a national narrative of what it means to be part of a society, a contributing member, someone who's worthwhile. That's put out there by this obvious need for what people should be doing. By the 90s, we lose that. It's just consumerism, right? That's the observation. And I point that out because I think that culturally, we have become too reliant on trendsetters, whether it's the Kardashians or it's CNN or it's Fox News or it's whatever, to tell us what our narrative is, to indicate what our values should be, to help us align to who we are and create our identities. And in doing that, we've sacrificed our self-awareness, our self-value. We have embraced the role as consumer. And I think what the next generation could do, what any generation could do, but obviously I don't know that my generation is doing this. What the next generation could do is really focus on a value system, because right now, my generation and maybe Gen Xers, our value system was completely turned towards how we can integrate into capitalist functions, how we can make more, spend less, buy the newest thing. What's moral or immoral? I'll tune in at 6 o'clock and they'll tell me. We need to understand as individuals what's right and wrong, particularly in a world that is going to change socially very, very quickly. Think about how much we've socially changed since the advent of smartphones and social media. I don't believe that the way in which technology advances will slow down in any way, shape, or form. You might say, well, yeah, but it couldn't really exponentially change how society grows with it. It totally could. What we need to be able to do as a society is to say, well, I'm not turning towards these tech overlords for what's right and wrong. I know what's right. I know what human value is. I know what's good for the climate, or I know what's good for my love. I know what my rights are, whether you agree with them or not. And this is a value that I'm going to be certain of, regardless of what you pay people to tell me. It's a value that I'm going to be telling people about because I hold it dear. And when it comes up, I will show up for it. I will vote for it. I will do whatever I have to do to advocate for that, instead of being like my generation, which has sat back and been like, oh, you lead me by the nose. As long as I can get the new iPhone and drive a new car, my life is good. Know thyself, love thyself, and love others, and focus on those things rather than what is cool, what is trending, and what can be purchased.
If your life was a book or a TV series or any medium whatsoever, what would its title be? And what would its soundtrack be?
This is a wonderful question. I think I would call it Holy Smokes, because I would want it to center around the realizations in life that take us by surprise, whether they're good things or bad things. And Holy Smokes is just some goofy thing that I say when I have a goofy little language, because I like to pretend I'm a little boy from a Silver Age comic book character. Holy socks! Stuff like that. And the soundtrack, gosh, that's a great question, because I've thought a lot about who would I get to do a horror soundtrack, but maybe not so much the soundtrack of my life. I like when they hire musicians to do orchestra soundtracks who don't normally do soundtracks, like when the Dust Brothers did Fight Club, or when they turned to Danny Elfman and they said, hey, stop Oingo Boingo and start doing soundtracks. So if I couldn't get Carter Burwell or John Bryan, who had a cool sound like Thundercat, Prof, it would be kind of silly to have a rap soundtrack because my life's not that hard. But it would be amusing, and I would enjoy that energy. It'd probably be good for me, more vibrant energy. Maybe I'd get out into the world. Oh, Poor Things. Yes, it is. It is. That's exactly right. The guy who did that soundtrack, that was his first soundtrack. What he did for that movie really captured what it was to have an alien experience, to be discordant and pleasant and yet beautiful. And that would be the kind of thing that I would love to see, is where someone takes this completely fresh approach. And it's not just like Alan Silvestri or John Williams. And you're like, yeah, that's a classic movie soundtrack. Sounds like all the others.
Well, Patrick, I do hate to say, but that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. I want to thank you so much for being on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
It means you'll have to come back on for book 2 and 3 whenever you get those done too. So your spot's always open.
Thank you so much.
Where can we find you? How can we support you? And of course, where's the Kickstarter campaign and anything else you need to promote?
Thank you. Well, the Kickstarter campaign to help me fund my paperback and hardcover inventory of Please Let Me Save You can be found by going to pleaseletmesaveyou.com, which will forward you to the Kickstarter page. You can also go to the Kickstarter website and search Please Let Me Save You, and you will be able to find it. If you would like to find my personal author website, you can go to patrickjosephhealy.com. I decided to use my middle name because it turned out that there were a lot of Patrick Healys in the world. Shouldn't have surprised me. It was my father's name and it was my uncle's name. But turns out there's a lot of Patrick Joseph Healys as well. But it's also Patrick Joseph Healy on TikTok and Instagram, which are my social media platforms of choice. I don't spend so much time on Facebook, and I'm just getting to know Blue Sky. Or if you want to follow me at the Tier Santa Bookstore on Instagram, it is my self-publisher website. And I sure would love to get more engagement over there. TIERRASANTABOOKSTORE.com. Tierra Santa Bookstore. My neighborhood where I grew up is this beautiful, small little neighborhood. And my mother always dreamed that we would have a bookstore here. And I was always like, there's not a market to support a bookstore. Bookstores are dying. So I thought it'd be cute to name the publishing label Tierra Santa Bookstore.
Well, like I said, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. You can, of course, find this interview and 1,200 plus others on our website, tgtmedia.com or twogeekstalking.com. That's TWO. Look, website's going through a complete rebuild. I'm only one person. Go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TGTmedia. That's always updated because that's easier to update and I don't have to host anything. Podcast is back at twogeekstalking.podbean.com or just search Two Geeks Talking wherever you get your podcasts. And as I say every week, everyone has a story to tell. It's up to me to help bring that out. Thanks for listening, watching on Two Geeks Talking.
Go on.